was located. The first burying ground for Sudbury and Wayland began in this spot with the building of the first meeting house in 1643. The meeting house was the center of town governance and community life at that time. Ms. Donahue will discuss the results of her research and will explain how the old burial ground changed and expanded from its original configuration in the 17th century to its current size and configuration. So we're all waiting to see what her research uncovered about the possible location of the 1643 meeting house, which has been thought by local tradition was over there. A second research goal for this study was to learn whether or not the traditional location of the Indian graves was authenticated during this study. There are burials way in the far corner that local tradition said were Indian graves, and we wanted to know if that was true. Lastly, she'll explain how we Wayland citizens can help to preserve this very important historical resource, which is very, very special because of its age. I want to confirm that not only the CPA money was used for this, but also money from the Department of Public Works budget. So that's very important to keep in mind. So it was an amalgam of both of those, it's a darn wind, an amalgam of both of those funds that enabled this study. So thank you, and welcome, Barbara. I'll see if they hear you. Put this on.
Okay, the question is, can everybody hear me? If not, I have to wear that.
Yeah, you're good.
All right, I'll keep talking loud then. I much prefer that. I do have a handout that has a little information from the report. I had printed out some of the covers of the report by mistake, so some people have the actual cover of the report in front of their information. But also in here is a management summary from the report, which explains a little bit about what it's about and the different component parts of it. I've also, from the report, put in this diagram, which is actually an 1857 plan of the cemetery overlaid on a current aerial. And it shows you the different years, the different sections of the burial ground, additions to the burial ground, just so you get an idea if we were talking about a little bit about the history. Next is part of the program was doing ground penetrating radar here. And this, I will explain to you what this is. This is one of the results of the ground penetrating radar. And after I talk about the history a little bit, I will discuss that. And finally, another part of this plan was a conditions assessment and also a stone-by-stone inventory of the stony section, which is right straight back there where mostly all the marble stones are. And this is the result of the stony section. The consultant who did that did an inventory form. I don't have the inventory form in yours. I did an inventory form on every stone up in the stony section that was at risk and that needed to be repaired, conserved. And so what I put in your report is his summary of all the stones that need to be fixed and the cost of that, and so that was another component part of this. All right, first off, what is a preservation management plan, which is what we did here. It's a sort of a base map for a road map for the history of the cemetery. It involves an in-depth land use history. It also involves a conditions assessment, and I add a ground penetrating radar survey to it. The setup of this plan, when the town hired me, was exactly what I had done in the Elm Street Cemetery in Braintree several years ago. And I believe that all three parts are necessary for a really good plan. And I'm the only one who actually does it like this. a lot of preservation plans only take into account the landscape. And they go over the landscape, the stones, they say this stone is at risk, how much it'll cost to do it. But really to understand the cemetery, you have to understand the history. And it's not just what's in history books either, because you only get a part of what's going on in history books. So I believe that you have to really do primary research and be very detailed orientated about it. And so for that result, I did deed research on this parcel to try to figure out all the different additions to it. And I also went into the town records from 1643 to 2012. Believe it or not, it sounds odd, but I went through all of them. And skimming through, for number one of the things that the town wanted to know about were the 3 meeting houses that were on the initial parcel of land. So I went through it trying to find out information about those 3 meeting houses. And then I wanted to find out any information in the records about the burying ground, how it was added on to what was done. Now, typical of most colonial burial grounds, they started in the 1600s. There really is nothing said in any of the town records, and I've done research at quite a few towns, saying anything about the burying ground. Because the Puritan burial ground was just a place to bury the dead. There was no commemoration. It was the idea of the death heads there were to scare people because they didn't know if they were saved, they weren't saved. And so it was just, it wasn't a place that anybody went and visited. It was just sort of left. There was just,
excuse me, you gotta talk a little louder for the people in the back.
okay. So,
Or you can wear this.
You can wear that.
I could wear it. You having a really hard time hearing me? Okay.
Yeah,
You could move up front. Save me a lot of angst here.
Conquer your fear.
Oh, you could come 5 feet closer.
Oh, that's
There you
true. I
go.
could come closer, yeah. I told you it'd be an adventure. Well, you know. I pretend I'm Madonna on stage.
Hello. Okay, now let me think of where I was. So totally lost my train of thought. Okay, a Puritan burial ground was basically just to bury the dead. Nobody went and maintained the grounds. Sometimes they would have cows come in, because it was common land, so people would have their cows graze there, and normally the town got paid for that because it was nutrient-rich grass and it was better than the other fields to, feed the cows. And that resulted in, number one, a lot of stones getting knocked over, lost from the cows. But early on, especially in the 1600s, you didn't have an awful lot of gravestones. Just because they weren't carving them here then, they were bringing them over from England as ballast in boats. And so really only a lot of rich people might have them, or they just weren't really done until later on in the century and into the 1700s. A lot of the earliest stones were like these over here. These are the earliest dated in this cemetery. And they'd be flat on the ground. And they just were inscribed. So that from that period on, you have to excuse me, I'm like very scattered with this stuff, and I hate giving talks, and this hearing myself is bothering me tremendously. But okay, let me just go over the plan first and who did the plan. I think I should start from that. Number one is a preservation management plan with 3 component parts: the history, conditions assessment, and a ground penetrating radar survey. Now, I was a lead consultant on the project, so I oversaw the whole thing. I did the historic research. I synthesized everybody else's results into the report. There's also a separate report of the ground penetrating radar in the back, but I put it all together, came up with the conclusions and recommendations. The conditions assessment, which was going over all the grounds, see how they're maintained. The back in the stony section, where they did a stone-by-stone assessment, was done by Shakura Foundation with Dr. Michael Trinkley and Debbie Hacker. Dr. Trinkley teaches cemetery preservation at the National Preservation Institute. He's been doing this for 20, 30 years now, and he's very conservative, and he's very good. I first met him when I took a course from him in Washington, D.C. Debbie Hacker works with Shakora, and she's a landscape, she does landscape for burial grounds, so she deals with the trees and all that. And then with the ground penetrating radar, usually I use that one day at the end, after I finish the research, after Dr. Trinkley finishes the conditions assessment, just to maybe answer questions that we have about below ground resources. Naturally, you could go over any of these burying grounds if you did it completely, and you'd find unmarked graves. The idea wasn't to look for unmarked graves, but to answer a question. Here, the Historic Commission had 3 questions in mind when we first started it. Number 1, where were the 3 meeting houses that were on the first, the original burying ground? This one has a stone in front of it saying that it was the location of the first burial ground. So that's all we had for knowledge on that. Number 2 was in the further section in the back on a plan, undated plan of the cemetery lots. They have 6 plots that are noted as Indian graves. So the question was, we went back there, were there burials there, number 1? It's very hard, you can't really define an Indian burial ground from a settler's burial ground, just because there's really no way to discern unless you did field work or something. And you're not going to go digging holes in the burial ground. And then the other question was, there was an idea that there had been a palisade, which would be a more like a fence type situation over in the new section that dated from the maybe 1700s, and to see if we could find any remnant of that over there. So that was that component. Now, that was done by Russell Kempton from New England Geophysical. And the 3 of us have all worked on about 3 or 4 preservation management plans prior to this. So with the history, there's a very complicated history of the town. Now in this second page here, I have an outline, of the show the different time periods of when this was added onto. Now the very first section of this, which would date till about the 1600s, that people thought was the earliest section, is down in front, and it was a half an acre. There aren't many stones down there, but really, maybe a lot of stones here got lost through the hurricane of 1938. There's a lot of things to get rid of stones around here, so it's very hard to say. And the only earliest stones from the late 1600s are over here, those flat ones. So it's unclear whether there were many stones here from that time period. So the next section that was added on to, that was here until in 1800. By the end of the 1700s, the graveyard was getting very, very flooded with people. They were running out of room, and they kept talking to town records about how they wanted to, add on to the graveyard. And they weren't sure exactly how to do that or how they were going to get the land. So they were trying to get land from the neighbor, and hopefully getting it for no cost, but they did pay for it. At that, it's hard to say how many people are buried in here because there weren't any records from that time period. And as I say, the first 3 meeting houses were in the earliest section, which was only a half an acre. So we can, it was on the road. It came up this way. Exactly where it ended up here is unknown, unless, because from the additions and everything, you're not sure. But the 3 meeting houses were over in this section. Now, when the first meeting house was here, it's stated here that it's the first meeting house. That is not my thoughts actually now. I believe this is the 3rd meeting house. I think the first meeting house is more or less in this area, sort of centralized, looking down. And it's because of results of the GPS survey that I have that idea about it. But there was a lot of information in the town records about how the houses was made, how they did additions to it, different things, what was problems they had with erosion and runoff in it. So when they had the first meeting house and they decided they had to have a bigger one, which because the community was getting bigger, they were still using the first meeting house when the second meeting house was being built. Now, after the second meeting house was ready, it took several years for that too. It wasn't like an overnight situation. After that meeting house was finished, the first meeting house was taken down. Someone bought the wood and used it elsewhere. Now, later on in the century, was it probably the 1680s, I believe, that meeting house was getting too small. So they built a third meeting house. When this third meeting house was being built, they were still using the second meeting house. So all during these two different time periods, you had two meeting houses actually on the property, the one being built and the one being used. Now, when the third meeting house was built, there was information that it was a square meeting house, which sort of, and they wanted to look like Dedham's meeting house. By this time, I mean, Puritanism was sort of waning, and people were really concerned about looks, you know, in the sense of they wanted the meeting house to look like the one in Dedham. They wanted certain things in the meeting house. It wasn't as barren as, say, the original meeting house was. Because things were changing in the country. Things were just changing all over. People were making money. So, you know, the whole ethic about Puritanism started really going down, I mean, towards the end of the 17th century, actually. It started changing. So the question is, in doing the research, where are these three meeting houses? Where were they? And so the ground penetrating radar was used. We did 7 grids around here. Mr. Kempton did with the radar. He did one over here where the meeting house supposedly is the first meeting house. He did one down there. He did across the middle. He did a big one up here where there's absolutely nothing to try to figure out what's up there. And he did one over here. Now, what he found out, as far as the meeting houses go, is that there was a meeting house down towards, right down towards the front there, where that sort of dip is. And that sort of, he could figure out dimensions somewhat of the structure. And so that was there. This was here. We still had no idea about the third meeting house, the first meeting house, you know, which meeting house is which. Now, when he was doing the ground penetrating radar across up in here, what he got, and you can see it, in this was first noticed. It was it's a pathway. It's about 8 inches down in the ground. It's not too wide, and it came from here, going up and around up that way. So it was something really unexpected. Now he also, you can see in this schematic here, this is right down in that area, and that was the outline of the meeting house. And the reporter has the outline of it on there, so you can see it better. Now, when we saw the path, the question was, where is it going? So he came back and he did another grid here, which would be down there. So they actually go this way. And then another grid down here to see if he could catch a beginning and an end to the path. And he did get a clearly defined beginning here, which seems to continue down. And up at this end, it's really hard to see, but it's just this little peak here is the end of the path, which is up that way. And then it couldn't really go any further because you have all the development from the, you know, the later extensions onto the burying ground. So the question is, what was the path leading to? What was the story with the path? And because normally, I mean, when we're first thinking about this and doing the research, you have reconstructed maps showing the lots that were along the street here early on. And you first, and with the first meeting house, it was described in the town records as being across the way from the Loca's house, which was right here. And John Loca, who owned this property, had given off either sold or given off the property to the town to use for the burying ground and for a meeting house. Anybody wants to stop me and have questions about this, just raise your hand, because it's a really confused history. And hopefully the report will get out so that you can read it and sort of think about it. So the normal thought is, well, you have this entranceway, this is a property boundary, this is the original entryway. Well, come to find out, when I was doing the deed research, if you check back on the additions, there was an addition put over here in 1800, and it comes up around here too. It was another half an acre. It was about 3/4 of an acre, which was added to the original half acre to make from 1800 on till 1835, sort of this section, exactly where the boundaries are. It's very hard to say on it. So in the town records, it said about, as I say, that the meeting house, the first meeting house, was across the way. Now, 1835, there was another addition put onto the burying ground, which you can see in the schematic. And it's sort of like a section up past that way, going straight back. Now, at that point, with that parcel of land in 1835, it was an interior parcel, and part of the deed description was an entryway coming in from this way going down to the street. So that entryway actually dates to 1835. It was not part of the original, it wasn't part of the original burial ground. And so that sort of knocked off the idea of the way being this, so that the meeting house would be just anywhere on this side. So the question is now, this appears to be a way coming in here, and we know where it is from, GPR and stuff. And if it was across the way, then that gives more idea of where that first meeting house was. And the way sort of came up this way, so the meeting house would be more over towards this side, which would be more of a centralized location, up higher. And I really personally think that it might have been where these people were buried, because they were buried during the time period of the second meeting house. They weren't here with the first meeting house. So my conclusion on this is, and there's a lot more research, there's a lot more about this in the report. It was a very complicated mess, to say the least. But my idea is that the first meeting house is somewhere over here. The meeting